Right. Good evening, everyone joining us here in person, everyone joining us online. Welcome to another evening lecture with Fraunces Tavern Museum. Remember, if you are joining us virtually, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box or in the chat. I'll be monitoring that throughout the lecture, so don't worry about saving it to the end. Put it in there so you don't forget. In person, I do ask that you wait till the end when we have time for our Q&A, and we'll make sure we'll go back and forth, get to as many as you can in the time allotted. And as always, this lecture is being recorded and will be available in a few days. If you registered, it will be sent to you. It'll be available on our website, on our YouTube, so you can share it with people who couldn't be here tonight or re-listen to it, re-watch it as much as you like. All right, so let's get started. As always, the views of the speaker are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York or its Fraunces Tavern Museum. Let me introduce tonight's speaker. Friederike Baer is Associate Professor of History and Division Head for Arts and Humanities at Pennsylvania State University, Abington College. Originally from Germany, Baer holds a PhD in Early American History from Brown University. Much of her research has focused on the experiences of German-speaking people in North America in the periods of the War for American Independence and the early Republic. Her work has been supported by organizations such as the American Philosophical Society, University of Michigan Clements Library, German Academic Exchange Service, and the Society of the Cincinnati. Her publications include the monographs, The Trial of Frederick Everly, Language, Patriotism, and Citizenship in Philadelphia's German Community, 1790 to 1830, and what we'll be hearing about tonight, Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. Right? I am now going to turn it over to our speaker.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much for this great introduction. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to be here today at Fraunces Tavern. It's really an honor. I've never been here before in this building, and it's a pleasure to be here and share my research about the German soldiers in the Revolutionary War with you all. I was told that there were more than 300 people registered to join us remotely, which is exciting. And if you are out there, wherever you are, maybe even Germany, welcome, and I'm really happy to have you all here this evening. I would like to say a few general words about who these German soldiers and civilians were, these thousands of troops that we know as Hessians, and how they ended up in North America. And then I will give a few, what I would call snapshots of their experiences over the course of the war. So a very brief introduction. In the 1770s and 1780s, as many as 40,000 German soldiers were hired to defend British imperial interests on 4 continents: in America, on Gibraltar and Minorca, in India, and in South Africa. The vast majority, at least 30,000, saw service in North America. In August 1776, a German periodical known as the Deutsche Chronik, or the German Chronicle, noted optimistically that, and I quote, "Soon the English will have to thank the Germans a second time for the conquest of America." The editor was here alluding to William Pitt's famous statement referring to Germany's role in the 7 Years' War about a decade earlier, a war that, as I'm sure many of you know, resulted in France ceding a large portion of its territorial possessions in North America, along with several Caribbean islands, to England, or to Britain. Early that same year, 1776, Britain's Prime Minister, Lord North, had predicted that the hire of the German auxiliaries would bring the war to a speedy resolution without, as he put it, the further effusion of blood. Of course, we know now that neither of these predictions came true. The steady supply of Germans, in fact, helped keep the war going for another 7 years. Before I continue, I would like to emphasize that by 1780-81, in other words, 4 or 5 years into the war, 1/3 of the British regular army strength consisted of German auxiliaries. So this was not just a few soldiers, this was a significant proportion of the British Army North America during that war. Let me also emphasize a couple of additional points before I continue. Britain's employment of foreign soldiers was nothing unusual. Britain fought most of its late 17th century and all of its major 18th century battles or wars with the help of foreign auxiliaries. And Britain was not unique in hiring foreign soldiers to fight its wars. France, Prussia, Russia, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, they all employed foreign soldiers at one time or another. In fact, in the 18th century, the typical European army was a multinational force. Second, the trade in soldiers, as it is sometimes called, was an acceptable form of revenue for many smaller territories, including the 6 German territories that ultimately essentially rented out their soldiers to Britain. It was a way to earn or to make revenue. In some of these cases, the rulers used the revenue to support lavish lifestyles. And this of course earned them a lot of criticism for quote unquote selling their subject, quote, like cattle to have their throats cut, as the King of Prussia put it in a very well-known letter to the French philosopher Voltaire. But they also used the revenue to pay off territorial debt and to fund projects that were designed to benefit the territories generally, such as the construction of villages, hospitals, museums, roads, and the like. In fact, even the King of Prussia, Friederike the Great, had to admit that hiring of troops was a practical way to raise revenue if the territory was facing serious debts, like, for example, the territory of Braunschweig did at the time. In addition, subsidy treaties should also be seen as political measures that allowed the rulers of smaller territories within the Holy Roman Empire to maintain a certain degree of power and influence, and in some cases, preserve their dynastic interests and gain protection from foreign powers. Several of the German rulers that ended up hiring out their subjects to King George III were related to them. The hereditary Prince of Braunschweig, for example, who co-ruled with his father until 1780. Then he took over as sole ruler over the territory of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel. He was married to Augusta of Hanover, the oldest sister of King George III, making the king the Duke's brother-in-law. And the Landgraf of Hessen was married to one of George II's granddaughters, Mary. Finally, these soldiers were not mercenaries. They're often referred to as mercenaries. When you Google them, Hessians, you will find references, plenty of references to Hessian mercenaries. And there is no doubt that there were individual soldiers in these corps that meet our definition of mercenary. However, mercenaries are soldiers who fight in a foreign army or war for personal profit. These regiments that we're talking about today and that are referred to as Hessians are better described as auxiliary troops. They were hired out as corps, as regiments, intact, so to speak, with their own commanders. The troops were raised by the German rulers. So how did they end up in the war in America? Well, in the spring of 75, Britain faced a very challenging task, and that was to raise a substantial army or military force that could be dispatched to America quickly. For various reasons, the king was not able to raise these troops at home in Britain or in other parts of the British Empire, even though, of course, he raised some troops at home in other places of the empire. He did what he, again, as I mentioned already, had done many times before. He turned to foreign rulers for support. In fact, he first turned to Russia. He hoped to hire 20,000 Russian troops for various reasons. The Tsarina, Catherine, turned him down. He then tried to use what was known as the Scots Brigade, a brigade that had been in Dutch service for several decades. The Netherlands, the ruler wavered, wasn't sure about it. Ultimately, that didn't work out. By the summer of 1775, several, possibly even according to French intelligence, already in 74, several German rulers had already offered troops to King George. Had written him letters and saying like, if you need troops, we have them. It would be an honor. We're dedicated to your cause if you would consider that. In the fall of 75, the king then is beginning to seriously exploring that possibility. Again, that was not shocking, really. He had done it many times before. Ultimately, 6 German territories agreed to rent out troops to the king. And I highlighted them here on that map with the approximate number of the total numbers of soldiers that ended up serving in North America. So the initial contracts or treaties, we call them subsidy treaties, that were signed, did not include these numbers. But over the course of the war, of course, there were replacement and reinforcement, so the numbers increased. So Waldeck, for example, sent 1 regiment, the so-called 3rd Waldeck Regiment, into British service. The number was maybe 750, something like that. Ultimately, though, replacements drove that number of men from Waldeck that served in America up to about 25. As you can see on this map, the largest number of men came from Hessen-Kassel. Hessen-Hanau at the time was ruled over by the hereditary Prince of Hessen-Kassel. They are 2 separate territories. But because so many of these soldiers came from there, we have referred to these troops collectively as Hessians. And that started already in the 1770s. And I think it was meant and also as a pejorative term, the Hessians. There are certain images attached to the Hessians, who they were, Hessian mercenaries. Many of these individuals were not actually Hessians. And I think when they would have never referred to themselves as Hessians. So something just to keep in mind. We use the term, but it creates, I think, it simplifies what in fact was a very diverse group of individuals from very different territories throughout German-speaking Europe. Germany, of course, I don't think I need to mention it, but maybe I should, just in case. Germany, of course, didn't exist at the time. These territories are part of the Holy Roman Empire. Here's something for all of you who like spreadsheets. And I don't expect you to be able to make this out in any way, but I do want to just mention, when you think about these subsidy treaties, and I mentioned there are various reasons why rulers might enter into them. But at the end of the day, it is a financial transaction. These rulers renting out soldiers or troops, entire regiments, and in return, they get money from Britain. The rulers get paid annual subsidies. Of course, no one knows in 1776, when these first treaties are signed, how long the war will last. But the treaties usually said, we're going to give you, the king or Britain will pay subsidies every year while the troops are in service, and then usually a year or 2 afterwards, sort of to wrap things up. Individual soldiers, of course, were paid, and the pay that they were getting was consistent with the British pay, which was fairly good for the time. That was clearly also meant as an incentive for soldiers to hopefully volunteer for service. Because it was ultimately a financial transaction, the bookkeeping was incredible. And that's one reason, I think, why we have a lot of records that really detail who these people were, when they served, and their numbers, records like this. This happens to be a regiment from Braunschweig, but I just put it up just really to illustrate, what was involved here. The reporting, the accounting for people. Are they there? Have they deserted? Have they died? Have they returned? Do we need more? Ultimately, that needed to be settled. These kind of things needed to be settled with Britain. So who were these? Who were these soldiers? The image, I think, is one of, again, I mentioned already, mercenaries, the men who go there for personal profit, go to America for personal profit, and that probably was the case again from for some of these individuals. There's also the image out there that they were forced into service. They were made drunk somehow. Trickery played a big role in recruiting the soldiers. This also no doubt happened. Officially, however, these men were supposed to volunteer for service. Officially, recruiters were not supposed to force men against their will to serve in this American war. At that time, the German territories did not have drafts in the modern sense. What they did usually do is they had sort of enrollment lists or sort of canton systems, as they were called, where officials would draw up lists of eligible men in their territories or in their villages, in their regions, and then they would kind of, request these men to report for mustering. They would be measured, and then they would be either deemed fit for service or not. Some of these soldiers or these men that ultimately ended up in these regiments had military experience, which of course was desirable. And it's always good to have someone who's maybe fired a gun before, for example. Most of these soldiers probably had never done that. So that's, I think, an important point to keep in mind as well when we're thinking about this war and warfare. When we think about American soldiers, I think, or the American army, we often have this image of sort of the citizen soldier, right, who takes up arms in defense of a cause. Many of these men presumably inexperienced in warfare. I think that's not that different here when we're looking at the Hessians. There are many of men who were recruited into this war. They did not necessarily object to military service, but they probably did object to serving in a war on another continent against an enemy who had done them no harm. That was a first. So even though Germans had served in British service before, they had never been used outside of Europe. So that is definitely something that they had to get used to. Many of these were not experienced soldiers. I put this document up here to kind of illustrate this. Waldeck, as I said, Waldeck sent one regiment into American service. Waldeck's a tiny territory. What Waldeck did is essentially recalled roughly 200 men that were already in Dutch service at the time. They were either what was known as the 1st or the 2nd Waldeck Regiment. They pulled these 200 soldiers out, and this is a certificate that certifies here that a soldier was taken from these regiments in order to be placed in the so-called 3rd Waldeck Regiment that was going to North America. So around 200 men had served in the Dutch military essentially before, but the other 400 or 500 had to be specially recruited for service in America. That was not an unusual kind of situation. All territories used what we call exemptions and certain criteria that would render a man eligible for service or would render him ineligible. So they all had to obviously, ideally, be physically fit to withstand a military campaign in North America. Height was important, although these criteria were relaxed as the war went on, and it got harder and harder to recruit soldiers. Ideally, they were unmarried, single, no children. They didn't really have dependents that they had to care for. They also were supposed to not be only sons, for example, or due to inherit property, or work in essential industries, in the mines, for example, or be a university student or be an apprentice. In other words, there are certain occupations. If the man occupied any of them, he's not supposed to go to America. If he was one of many sons, perhaps, or a younger son, or a poor man, unattached, maybe even a troublemaker, sort of the town drunk, then he was definitely eligible to go to America, and these men often were added to these lists of perfect candidates. We do have in the archives letters from families, wives in particular, or in-laws, who appealed to the authorities and asked to have a husband or a son-in-law sent to America because he was, for example, drinking too much, or he was a threat to his daughters, or he was a no-good, lazy individual who did not contribute anything to the support of his family. There are literally appeals from families in Hessen to the Landgraf, and can you please take this man out of my hands? In some cases, local authorities were perfectly happy to do that. They agreed. It's like, this man is better off, more used to the territory. if we send them to America. Petty thieves, petty criminals often were also targeted for this kind of service. These appeals did not always work. There's one case, for example, where a woman writes a letter to local authorities and said, my husband, he is no good, free us from this evil man, he writes in her letter. Turns out that this individual was a wig maker. And neighbors in that town wrote, when they're hurt, that his family is trying to get rid of him, to the authorities and said, yeah, there might be trouble in this relationship. That's between them, and the wife is probably to blame for some of this as well. But he is the only wig maker in town, and we'd really like to keep him here. And that's exactly what happened. The authorities ultimately agreed. So when you look at this, there are many cases sort of like that, variations of this. When you look at it that way from the territorial's perspective, it's like, what use is this man? Is he useful at home? Is he contributing? Is he supporting the economy, the territorial economy, whatever? If the answer is yes, definitely we need him home, he was less likely to be recruited. If the answer was, well, actually, we get more use out of him if he goes to America, more likely to be sent. And I am generalizing because at the end of the day, it was very difficult to raise the core. So there, amongst these troops, are many men who were needed at home, who were taking care of their families, who did leave behind wives and small children or in-laws or widowed mothers who had depended on them for their livelihoods. So we do have in there the files in the archives also many letters to rulers and local authorities begging for their husband or their father or their brother not to be sent to America. So they've certainly created quite a lot of hardship, the departure of these individuals. As I mentioned, the men were supposed to volunteer. How we define volunteering is tricky. What is a volunteer exactly? For example, if you are facing economic hardship at home, if you don't see much of a future for yourself at home, if you were maybe tricked into signing up, if there's peer pressure, maybe you don't get along with your parents, whatever, it becomes difficult to talk about volunteering when there's potentially all these forces or some of these forces at play. So I just want to point that out. Ultimately, we think that many of these people did not volunteer because something is going on in their lives that made service in America a more attractive option than staying at home. Here's the recruiting certificates. I just translated sort of the key information. One reason why I wanted to show this to you is, first of all, I think it's incredibly interesting that these certificates were printed. Obviously, there's great need for these kind of forms, so they printed them. But there's also, what I also find interesting about this particular one, which is Braunschweig, is that it dates to 1782. When we hear about the American Revolutionary War, we often think or hear, or typical textbooks end with Yorktown. Fall of 1781, the last major battle of the Revolutionary War, war is sort of over. Well, when we're focusing on the German troops, their presence in North America, and for how long they were recruited, we get a little bit of a different impression. The British recruited German auxiliaries into early 1783. The large major shipment leaves in the winter of 1782. So this guy, this is in 1788, gets recruited, and he may have ended up in North America. This is long after Yorktown. So it makes you wonder sometimes what Britain had in mind here. Where were these people supposed to head? Did they think maybe there was another campaign that would have been possible? So I think this is an interesting. The other important point I think that I want to mention here is the bounty of 5 thaler, roughly £1 at the time. The servants' wages were maybe 1 or 1.5 thalers a month at that time. So for a man to get a bounty of 5 thaler, that's an incentive. That's quite attractive. I mean, that's money that he's just getting just for signing up. And that's clearly meant to entice people to go. Now, were there reasons why a young man in the Holy Roman Empire would have wanted to go to North America? There certainly were many reasons. It's like, I think, at any other time, military service does create opportunities. There were certainly young men who were looking for a career in the military, and to really make significant advancements in peacetime is challenging. So war does offer opportunity for advancement. Officers in particular really clamored to go to America because they were hoping for promotions ultimately. But not just officers. Some men who were, started in the private ranks also hoped for promotion. Search for adventure. The desire to see a place, a different continent that was at the time really still very much inaccessible to many Germans. North America was not that well known in terms of what's happening there, the land and the people. Certainly knowledge about the war was extremely limited. An estimated 80,000 Germans had emigrated from Holy Roman Empire to North America or the British colonies by the time of the Revolution. But their presence in North America did not mean that many people back home in Europe knew much about this fascinating, what they're called, New World. So we have some individuals who specifically sign up to explore, essentially. And here's on the right is a publication by one scientist, we would call him now a scientist, chef, who does that. He signs up with he was actually looking to go to South Asia at the time when he heard there was this opportunity to go to America, and he signed up, he went, he explored the American land and the people. He published several books and pamphlets. Here's an example about vegetation, essentially North American vegetation. His name is David Chef. On the left is an example of a letter that was published during the war already in a very popular periodical in Germany. So we have also writings by mostly officers who are not scientists in a modern sense of the word, but who are very curious about what North America is like. And they spend a lot of time, some of them, exploring the countryside and visiting museums and looking for mammoth bones and things like that, collecting fossils, and they wrote things down, send it back to Germany specifically for publication. I mention this because the soldiers, they're coming to North America, they obviously have an impact on the war, but they also have an impact on their home communities. And one of the consequences is the sharing of knowledge. The writings, the publications, they're also collected objects. General Knyphausen, who is the commander of the Hessian forces, himself ordered Hessian regiments to keep detailed records, detailed journals of each and every occurrence during their campaigns, and to collect specifically Native American artifacts and then bring them back home. And we have in an archive in Kassel a small receipt that mentions that he himself brought home to a professor there a sugar cane and a small pouch with crystals. So the Hessian commander himself collected objects as well and brought them back home. So all of this, writings, images, drawings, objects, help broaden the knowledge of North America and the war in Europe. And in some ways, I think these soldiers acted like almost like foreign correspondents. The soldiers, they were recruited obviously in their home territories, transported to ports in Germany and in the Netherlands, then taken over to England, and from there, especially in '76, massive troop transport, they were sent to North America. I'm going to skip over this part. There's a lot of that in my book because it's, as you can imagine, a massive logistical, complicated undertaking. I want to put this map up as a kind of a reminder too, that the German troops participated in every major battle in the American Revolutionary War, and in pretty much every minor one as well, with the exception of the battles in the West. So there are a couple of campaigns that they were not part of. I'm emphasizing this because when we hear about the Hessians, we often kind of reduce them to a couple of major encounters. Most famously, of course, Trenton, right? Most of you probably heard of Trenton. And there's good reason for this, a significant American victory, kind of a turning point, morale boosting, you know, Washington, that amazing crossing of the Delaware, and then taking maybe as many as 1,000 Hessians captive, the battle of Christmas Day on Trenton. So that is truly sensational, but the vast majority of German soldiers were not at Trenton and did not take part in this at all. So it is an important event, but it is not representative of the experience of the troops in the war. The campaigns that are highlighted here on the map include the Canadian campaign, of course, Burgoyne's ill-fated journey into New York that ended with the Battle of Saratoga in '77, where several thousand German troops were taken prisoner. And then we have, of course, before that, the New York and New Jersey campaigns. I put fall '76 kind of ... because, as you all well know, New Jersey is British headquarters for the entire war. There's fighting going on for not just in '76, the occupation of Philadelphia, the Southern campaign, of course, Yorktown, and then last but not least, the presence of British and German troops in West Florida that had remained loyal to Britain. So that was not one of the rebellious colonies. All of these campaigns, and again, these are just the major ones, all of them included large numbers of German troops. So we have to remember that. When we can't just think of Trenton, maybe Saratoga, maybe Yorktown, they actually involved in all of them, including West Florida, which I think gets overlooked in most accounts of the Revolutionary War. So let me just give you talk a little bit about what it was like for them. When they came here, when the troops came here, the first contingent actually left in the spring. They had to be assembled and sent within a matter of weeks. So the first leave in the spring of '76, the first ones actually arrived in Canada. But then in the summer, in August and then later in October, 2 divisions of Hessians arrive in New York. And this is here memorialized in this nice engraving by a German artist. And he, we know from German records, and we have a lot of German records, that they were very impressed with the city and with the country around it. They admired the architecture, they admired the buildings, they talk about major roads. They're especially impressed with the fertile land, the farms, the orchards. They are just really believe that they had to basically, when they arrived, for example, on Long Island, they set foot on the garden of all of North America. It's just, especially from a German perspective, the abundance was just truly amazing. Sadly, and this kind of goes hand in hand now with initial impressions, sadly, the prosperity seemed to have corrupted the inhabitants. Indeed, the view of the land was so favorable that many of the German observers speculated that the reason for the rebellion could not possibly be oppression by the mother country, as the Americans were claiming. From their perspective, the colonists had little reason to complain. If anything, many had become lazy and decadent. Lieutenant Johann Heinrich Henkelmann remarked in a letter to Kassel that the white inhabitants of New Jersey, and I quote, lived like pigs. They drank and ate several meals a day, and the women spent their time waiting for their tea and decorating their homes. The evident abundance of goods also encouraged Americans to be extremely wasteful with what the Germans considered to be very valuable resources like firewood, for example. Most Germans could not fathom why such a prosperous people would take up arms against a benevolent king under whose watch they had obviously done so well. The Germans concluded, therefore, that the rebellion must have been the work of a few conspirators of selfish and sinister intentions who were deluding the American people into believing that they were struggling from liberty from oppression. A few evil men, committee men, as one Hessian put it, were conspiring to make themselves masters of the people under the pretense of fighting for freedom. One Hessian chaplain actually mentioned in a letter to Kassel, if there was a people in America that should be struggling for their liberty, it would be Black people. The evident wealth of the New York region contrasted starkly with the desolation that the rebels had brought to their own country. Without the proper British oversight, so it seemed to the Germans, the nation's prosperity was rapidly declining. Now remember, when they arrived in New York, the war had been going on for more than a year. So when they're arriving in some of these regions that they're going to see over the fall of '76, they do see a lot of destructions. They were shocked by the extent of destruction, particularly of civilian properties in the New York region. They found villages abandoned, homes plundered, cattle killed, fields burned. Not surprisingly, the population that was hit hardest were people that were or were suspected to be loyal to the crown. The Americans' treatment of the civilian population helped create an image of them as undisciplined and unprincipled. And I think this experience also helps explain, at least in the early phase of the war, why the German troops saw themselves as liberators rather than occupiers. And they were often confused when they arrived in different regions and cities, why the people were not welcoming them accordingly. Confirmation that the Americans were really basically vengeful fanatics came soon after the Germans' arrival in America with the Great Fire of New York, as it became known, that was set in September of 1776, so mere weeks after the arrival of the 1st Division. Hessians were convinced that the fire, which destroyed about a quarter or so of the city, that the fire had been set by the Americans. The Hessian officer, Andreas Wiederhold, was shocked, and I quote, that the evil and disobedient rebels were deliberately destroying their blessed land and habitations. Another observer said, the evil sentiments of this nation are indescribable. They were destroying the nicest regions in the entire world. And over the next few years, the view of a fanatical enemy was reinforced over and over again as German troops saw burned and pillaged homes, fields and forests in other regions as well, including Maryland, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, Virginia, and Georgia. And ultimately, these experiences combined with military setbacks also raised doubts in the minds of the German soldiers whether the enemy could in fact be crushed, given their stubborn determination to defeat Britain. They were obviously willing to sacrifice everything in defense of their cause. And as time went on, there was no indication that this resistance was diminishing. At one point, a Hessian officer said that as long as the Congress can raise 1,000 men, they will not give up. Initially, however, the Germans did not have much respect for the Americans as a worthy enemy. As I mentioned before, many German soldiers were young men who had been recruited specifically for the war in America. They were not necessarily more experienced in warfare than their American counterparts, so to speak. But from the perspective of someone who belonged to a highly hierarchical and disciplined army that stressed the neat and orderly appearance of all of its members, from private to general, the Americans did not even seem to look like soldiers. Here's an image of the von Kniphausen regiment. That's one of the regiments that was at Trenton. For example, German soldiers were either clean shaven or they wore neatly groomed mustaches, which you can see, I think, is nicely depicted here in this image. Many of the Americans were described by the Hessians as unshaven, thus giving them the appearance of one Hessian called a Spitzbuben, or a scoundrel, rather than soldiers. Shortly after his arrival on Long Island, a Hessian officer wrote in a letter to Kassel that he did not have a razor. He was embarrassed that at times he had a beard like a rebel. The Hessian troops, moreover, were very well uniformed, at least in the beginning or the early phase of the war. They were very proudly wore uniforms with colors that identified them as members, as belonging to particular military units. They found that many Americans were dressed in torn rags of different colors, or miserable outfits typically worn by poor farmers, and they brought their own guns to battle instead of carrying some kind of standard issue weapons. For the most part, then they found that American soldiers didn't just look undisciplined, but they also seemed to act undisciplined and lack loyalty. From the German perspective, and this is especially true in the fall of 1776, when I'm sure you know, things did not really go that well for the Americans. From the Hessian perspective, the typical American soldier was a coward who ran at the first sight of the enemy. Washington's retreats that we now celebrate as strategically really smart, his refusal to meet the British in large-scale battles, Hessians thought, were not based on strategic decisions. Rather, they were due to the spinelessness of his soldiers. Basically, he had no choice. They were taking off. Some officers even contemptuously compared the war to a hunt. According to the chaplain Becker, who I already mentioned earlier, the Hessians were charging after, as he put it, the countless bands of gypsies. That's how he described the American troops. And at the Battle of Harlem Heights in the fall of 76, the American colonel, Joseph Reed, was enraged when British and Hessians, quote, sounded their bugles in the most insulting manner, as is usual after a fox chase. One exception to this unflattering view of the American military were the riflemen, but even these troops were regarded with some ambivalence. While most Germans feared and respected these, I want to call them sharpshooters, their effectiveness as soldiers was limited in part by how long it took them to reload their weapons. They were really just effective if they were surrounded, they were in surroundings such as woods, where they could hide behind trees like hunters. And that was criticized by many of these Hessian observers. The strategy of ambushing an unsuspecting enemy may have been effective, but it was also described as dishonorable. In 1777, a private, we do have a few records written by privates, wrote to his parents in Hessian that the Americans were not like regular soldiers, but rather, and I quote, more like robbers and thieves, and that they hide in hedges and bushes and shoot so well when they are able that they hit every time. I should mention that the counterpart, the German counterpart of these riflemen, were what we know called the Jäger, which is a German word for hunter. These were hunters and gamekeepers in Germany that were specifically recruited also for this war, and turned out to be particularly useful in North America. So in general, then, at least in the first couple of campaigns, the Hessians regarded the Americans as an inexperienced, undisciplined, and poorly equipped enemy that they were chasing most of the time. As one officer put it, it was fortunate that they were fighting against a nation that was unfamiliar with real warfare. It took the Germans a while to abandon this preconceived notion about the proper appearance and behavior of an army. The Germans created a huge volume of records, both public and private, that documents their experiences in North America. And my study, my book, is based largely on this archival material. So it is very much an effort to really understand what it was like for these soldiers to be here and to kind of tell the story of the Revolutionary War, tell their story, so to speak. The records that I just put up on the slides here include a letter. I'd include the middle one with that cute heart is a regimental journal by the regiment von Bose, which was is famous for the participation in the Southern campaign. We have a lot of maps drawn by soldiers, some post-battle. This is clearly post-battle. It looks like a great piece of art. Some more sketchy, sort of doing battle or preparation of battle. And then we have embarkation lists and master rolls, and we also have some published material. So taken together, this really sheds new light, I think, on the war, not just on what it was like for these soldiers and civilians, but also on the war generally. And I just want to highlight 3 of these records to tell you a little bit what I mean by that. The first one is a private letter that was written by a Braunschweig officer who is in Canada. His name is August du Roy. And he spent many years in Canada. He is some of the time bored. He is clearly homesick. We know this from other letters. He complains often that he hasn't heard from anyone in Germany or even from fellow soldiers somewhere else in North America, in some cases in years. It's very isolating to be out there. This is a letter that he wrote to his brother who is a physician back in Braunschweig. It's about 3 pages plus this one, which you can see is a sheet that was used then ultimately to fold around to create an envelope. But he wanted to fill every available inch, essentially. He filled the 2 margins around the address as well. And on the right, I included a map that indicates where he was located at that time. The letter is interesting because I think it's very rich. He writes, so again, it's a private letter. He had been, when he writes this letter in 1781, he had been in Canada or in North America for 5 years. At that time, he's one of an estimated 5,000 Germans that are stationed in Canada. When I say Canada, what I really mean is Quebec, and what I really mean is essentially along the St. Lawrence River, mostly between Quebec and Montreal. I mean, that's really where European settlement was concentrated, and that's where these troops are quartered for most of the time. In his letter, he mentions that he's happy that he was recently moved to a new post because where he is now, Lotbinière, he argues his regiment will be of more use. We know that the Americans did not attack Canada after the ill-fated attempt in 75, before the Germans even arrived there. But the Germans don't know that then. So when he is there, and when these 5,000 other Germans are stationed there, they are on constant alert. They do not know that maybe the Americans might not make another attempt on Canada. And of course, by this time, France had entered the war on the American side. So there's that added threat as well from potentially the French fleet. So when he writes, he's not writing like, I'm sitting around bored, nothing to do. He's like, I'm here, you know, we're stationed here, we're isolated, we don't really know what's going on in the war, honestly, because we haven't received communication. But I'm happy now, I'm at a place where the regiment can be of more use. We can defend the province should there be an attack. He also talks a little bit about the environment. This is a rugged environment, very unfamiliar to the Germans. It's very mountainous. The water, the rapids in the rivers, famous, of course. Soldiers had to learn to navigate them in what were called the bateaux, those vessels that they used. And he mentions to his brother, and this part I thought was interesting. He says, every German soldier at this point had learned how to march and do drills wearing snowshoes. And he says, you know, to his brother, picture that for a moment. Imagine that. You're a countryman going out on patrol. Every patrol is accompanied by at least 50 Native Americans. And they're wearing snowshoes. Every one of them is wearing snowshoes. And they're racing with these Native American allies. They're racing in snowshoes. They're racing with the best of them. And he says to his brother in Germany, imagine that for a moment. It's astonishing to him that where he is and that's what German soldiers are doing. They've learned to do it. He also says that despite the harsh winters, despite the isolation, that he's never been as healthy in his life now that he's gotten used to the climate. And I think a little joke or, you know, teasing his brother, again, the brother physician, he says, I'm also really healthy because I've not had any medical care in a number of years. No medicine to make me sick. So he feels pretty good, basically. And he also says, I have no idea when the war will be over and when or if we'll ever return to Germany. So it's a very detailed personal letter. Mixed. There's also a lot of asking about how our siblings are doing. But it is one experience representative, I think, of again a large number of soldiers who were in Canada. And then the other document that I want to share deals with is related to prisoners of war. That prisoner captivity was a common experience for German soldiers. We estimate that between 5,000 and 6,000 soldiers became captives, American prisoners, as a result of 5 or 6 events alone. And that's of course Trenton. It's in 76. It's Bennington in the fall of 77. Saratoga in 77. Yorktown in 1781. And then this event, the capture of 2 transports off the coast of New York in September of 1779. These transports carried German troops from New York. They were destined to Canada, to Quebec. Many of these troops had recently been released from captivity. They had actually been taken at Trenton. Shortly after their departure from the port of New York, they sailed into a massive storm. And as a result of the storm, one of the vessels sank, taking more than 200 men, women, and children with it. They died. 2 of the vessels were so damaged that they essentially just started drifting around until they were ultimately captured by American capers. And so one of the officers that is part of that, his name is Andreas Wiederholt, he kept the diary, and on the right are his drawings from the diary, sort of a before and after picture of the vessel that he was on, the Triton. When he says that they were captured, and all of these troops then re-entered captivity, including Wiederholt, he says in his diary, we were happy to be off these miserable ships and on God's earth, if America was God's earth. So happy to be saved, knew he was lucky, but obviously captured by the Americans. I also highlighted here the fact that there are women and children on these vessels. And I should have mentioned this earlier, of course, that these soldiers that were sent over from Germany were accompanied by hundreds and hundreds of civilians, hundreds of women, and dozens. We don't know exactly, the evidence is often anecdotal, but a large number of children as well. And here's a record that proves essentially that there are women and children on these vessels. The last document that I want to share deals with the campaign in West Florida. So between 1778 and 1781, Britain sent transports with troops to the south on multiple occasions, and by the southern rebellious colonies, including Georgia and Carolinas and Virginia. Each of these transports included German troops. In late 1708, Britain also sent reinforcements to West Florida. There were already British troops stationed there, but Britain was worried about a potential French threat. More importantly, worried that potentially Spain might want to try to get West Florida back. And that's worry was well founded. That's exactly what happened. So Britain sent troops back, maybe around 1,300. Half of them were German. That is the Waldeck Regiment. The entire Waldeck Regiment had been on Staten Island in garrison for a couple of years, identified as you go to Pensacola to help defend West Florida from foreign threats. The story of this regiment it's just tragic. I mean, there's no other way to put it. The regiment arrives in West Florida, so they're sailing down there, 4-week stopover on Jamaica, which is also described in a couple of diaries. They arrive in Pensacola, complaining from the very beginning. It is hot. There is all this critters, vermin around. Many Native Americans, thousands by some of these session accounts, you never know if they're friend or foe. That is a common complaint by German soldiers. So they're Native Americans, some are allies, but you can't be sure. And some Hessians were killed by Native Americans in West Florida during this time period, presumably allies. To make a long story short, Hessians, along with British soldiers, are sent to the Mississippi to defend a couple of forts, Fort Butte, for example. One after the other, however, they fall to the Spanish. The Spanish are attacking, ultimately put Pensacola under siege, and Pensacola surrendered. So it's a very short version of a much more complicated story, of course. When Pensacola surrendered, the regiment had been reduced to about half its size, mainly because of disease. Few men were also killed in combat, and then, of course, we also had desertions. So this regiment is, one of the officers at that point says, we have like 250 men left. Again, the strength is more than 700. This is nothing. So it's absolutely miserable. The good news is that Spain agreed to send those people, the soldiers, British and German, that were captured, that had surrendered at Pensacola, to send them back to New York, paying for the transports. So there's actually the British officer sends a letter to the ruler of Waldeck, who had been worried about what's going on with my soldiers. Are hearing they're like in the south. This is really unhealthy climate, and ultimately the official in Britain sends a letter basically saying, "Good news, they're surrendered, and they're given back to New York, and they can even fight again the war again. So you should be happy." He really puts a positive spin on it, that they're getting out of this unhealthy province. They, of course, never fought again in the war, because this is shortly before Yorktown, and more or less major hostilities ceased after that. The last person, I'm wrapping up in a second, the last person that is mentioned on the embarkation list of these German troops on these Spanish transports going to New York is identified as a Black woman. We know nothing about her except that she is a woman, she's Black, and she's free. And I wanted to just say a few words about the presence of Black men and women and children who were in some ways attached to German military units over the course of the war. Here are a couple of, the evidence for their presence tends to be anecdotal, but we have enough to establish that several hundred at one time or another were attached to regiments, either formally as drummers or musicians, for example, or maids or servants. Many, of course, also informally in some kind of capacity. Many of these individuals were refugees, essentially, trying to escape enslavement. Some undoubtedly ended up with the German regiments as what we call plunder. They were seized by their enslavers. Children in particular were seized and in some cases sent back to Germany as gifts over the course of the war. So this is a complicated story for sure. I wanted to show you a couple of documents that serve as evidence for the presence of these Black individuals in the military. On the left is a muster roll This is artillery company that is in Brooklyn at the time, 1781. The commander, his name is Poisch. He is sending a list of individuals that are with them, and you can clearly see that there are 4 men that are identified as Black men. 3 of them are drummers, and 1 is a servant. These regiments, and Poisch himself actually wrote a letter at some point home to his ruler saying that it would like to recruit Black men, particularly as musicians, wholly consistent with European ideas of Black individuals as exotic and prestigious. These individuals would be dressed in turbans and feathers and colorful outfits to lend prestige to regiments. So Poisch himself advocated for that, and you see evidence here that his own artillery company had at least 3 Black drummers. On the right is a baptismal record from Braunschweig after the war that documents the baptism of 5 Black drummers that had been recruited in North America. And obviously it's difficult to read, but the godfathers, the sponsors, I should say, the sponsors of these individuals are all officers, veterans of the war in North America, including Riedesel, who is the commander of all the Braunschweig troops in Canada and other parts of America during the war. Here's an image from a Hessian regiment where you can see the depiction of a Black drummer, and you can see how he's dressed. So North America, I think the war in some ways presented at least some of these officers an opportunity to add Black musicians in particular to their units. We estimate that around 200 or so Black men, women, and an unknown number of children did go back to Germany with the regiments after the war. And I'm sure there are more research needs to be done. But some of these individuals decided, it's complicated, but ultimately ended up accompanying the troops back. So my final slides, just kind of a breakdown. We estimate that maybe 17,000 or so troops survived the war. No, I'm sorry. Of the survivors, 17,000 or so returned to Germany. So the majority returned to Germany. We estimate that 1,200 or so were killed in action. And then the main cause of death, of course, was disease, as is typical for 18th century wars. So maybe 6,400 or so died of illness or some kind of accident, drowning, and so forth. Roughly 5,000 decided to remain in North America or settle in North America. Some of them already got either deserted or got their discharge during the war. So they already settled in North America before 1783. Many did not report for embarkation. They basically just decided to stay back behind. At least half of these actually ended up in Canada. Canada was in a very attractive location, remained British, of course. Britain also offered land grants to members of the armies who decided to go there. So there were incentives created for soldiers, especially Protestants, who wanted to settle in Canada. But most of them, about 17,000, ultimately decided to go back. So what do we learn from this when we look at these kind of records? I think that I looked at these German soldiers as sort of participant observers. They are in the midst of war, of course. They're in it. They're in these battles. They write about it. They're in America. They visit all locations, regions from Canada to West Florida. But they're also observers in the sense that they are not American. They are not British. They're not directly involved in the sense that they're not fighting for a cause in that sense. So their observations and descriptions they're not neutral. No one is objective or neutral, but they strike me as, in some cases, particularly helpful in our efforts to get a sense of what it was like in America during the war, what the land was like, what the culture, customs was like, what the people were like. It also draws up regions, I think, that are often neglected, like Canada, Nova Scotia. I didn't mention Nova Scotia, but there's a Hessian regiment in Nova Scotia for most of the war. And then, of course, West Florida and maybe even Jamaica. It also, I think, serves as a reminder that this was a very violent war. I talked less about the brutality and the violence of the conflict, but I think we need to remember that this is a brutal, long conflict that had far-reaching consequences for Americans and people in other places in the world. One Hessian officer said he observed towards the end of the war that it was a war, in his words, that went against all humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Baer, for that engaging, informative discussion. We do have a couple questions coming in from online. If anybody in the room has any questions, just also please raise your hand and I'll get to you soon. First question, what kind of training did the new recruits receive and where were they trained?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I said, especially for the first round of raising the troops, when the subsidy treaties were signed, there was very little time to get them outfitted and basically on these transports into America. So that all had to, in some cases, in 3-4 weeks, they were raised, recruited, sent off. So there was very little, there was some time, but very little time to get them some basic training at least before they left. There is, however, plenty of evidence that they did receive some training after their arrival in North America. And I think Canada is a good example. For example, we have the commanders, the British and German commanders offered rewards for shooting practice. So we have records that indicate that the men were encouraged to shoot with live ammunition, target practice, and they got rewards for that. And they were also trained in navigating the rivers. They were trained to march through informations or to adapt to the terrain and so forth. So there's some training in Germany, if at all possible. There's certainly training in North America as well.
Great, thank you. Next question. The bookkeeping is very impressive. Do these records show how much they were paid per month? This is a multi-part question. Did they show how much compensation would be paid for a soldier who died in battle? And finally, do you know how much it was in today's money?
That's a really good question. I can tell you that even the people back then who were dealing with us, officials in Germany and in Britain and in America, are struggling with figuring these things out. A lot of the time, the numbers are unreliable. We're dealing with different currencies. It's very, very challenging. So I'm hesitant to give you firm numbers. However, we do know how much people were paid. I mean, that's clearly in the documents in terms of by rank, for example. Obviously, it is a range of wages. We also know for all of these regiments or all of these units from these 6 territories, how much individual soldiers set aside to have sent back or sent to their families back home. So the financial records are there. You can find out details, but it is it's complicated and not always consistent, I would say.
Understood. Another question. You mentioned it was Great Britain's war and that some were sent by their governments. Did these soldiers abandon their posts at higher rates than British soldiers, especially as it became apparent that the British would lose?
I'm not sure about comparing to British soldiers. I think it's been established that the rate of desertion was not unusually high. It was not higher than it would have been in any other war during this time period. What you can see when you look at desertion from, I think you can see patterns. When the army is well equipped and things are going well, the desertion rates will be relatively low. They will not be at 0, but they will be relatively low. But then you look at times when there is when things are not going well, around or after defeats, desertion rates tend to go up. And they also, in this case here, go up for soldiers that had lingered in captivity for extended periods of time. And that had, I think, in some cases, either gotten used to their surroundings, they had made contact with locals, sometimes married local American women that were near their places of internment, and in some cases had given up that they would ever be exchanged or sent out on parole. So there's definitely, you can definitely see patterns for desertion.
Great, thank you so much. One question from the audience here.
Oh, thank you. The Hessians had a reputation, rightly or wrongly, among Americans as killing Americans rather than capturing them. How accurate is this this reputation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, the reputation and that precedes them almost before they even set foot on American soil. You get a lot of what we call propaganda by American patriots, as we call them, about, you know, really painting the Hessians as these incredibly violent, brutal invaders, you know, come to pillage our homes and rape our women and, you know, murder innocent civilians. That image emerges already in the spring of '76, as soon as the Americans know Hessians are coming. And they're using this to build up resistance, to, first of all, encourage support for independence, because independence hadn't been declared yet, but also to mobilize men in particular, then over the summer and fall of '76, to take up arms, to defend their homes against these defenders. So it is sometimes difficult to determine from all the information that's out there whether it is describing real experiences, facts, or whether this is embellished or exaggerated and really didn't exactly happen that way. I would say that the Hessian plunder, yes, absolutely. Did they commit atrocities and crimes towards civilian population? Absolutely. Did they sometimes deny soldiers' quarter, as it's called? I think that happened as well. And I'm not defending it, but I would say it also happened on the other side as well. If you ask a German soldier, there's a famous letter after the Battle of Brooklyn that was published in a newspaper that basically says the Germans are not giving quarter, meaning they killed a vanquished enemy. And the Hessians say, like, well, if that happened, that's because we were told they'll kill us. So we have no choice. So that's sort of the rhetoric that you get here. There's a lot of violence and atrocity, and some of it was certainly perpetrated by the German troops, no doubt about it. But there's also a lot of propaganda out there. I hope that.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, this will be our last question.
Hi there. King George III obviously was part of the Hanoverian dynasty,
Yes.
and I think he was still elector of Hanover
Yes.
at the time. So I'm just curious in terms of the troops from the various regions in Germany. There doesn't seem to be any from Hanover.
Well, that's a good question. There are Hanoverians that support the war, but indirectly, and so therefore they're not generally considered to be Hessians in that sense. There are several thousand Hanoverians that are sent to the Mediterranean, where they are relieving British soldiers that are then sent to North America. So they're certainly participating, and you're absolutely right. And he does that because he's the elector of Hanover and he's using his subjects in this war. Absolutely.
All right, that was our last question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here for our speakers. Thank you to our wonderful speaker. That was really interesting about a topic I think we don't often hear too much about. And thank you for all of you for joining us in person and on Zoom, for your time supporting the museum, for asking your questions. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like to stay up to date with all of our programs, you can join our mailing list by going to FrauncestavernMuseum.org. There you will also find our social media accounts as well as the calendar of upcoming programs. Our next lecture, a bit of a break, is until Thursday, May 18th. But at the end of this month, we do have our book award dinner. You can check out that information on our website. Thank you to those of you who have donated to the museum. Your generous support helps us fulfill our mission and share the history of the American Revolutionary era with the public. If you would like to make a donation, you may also do that on our website. So thank you again for joining us at Fraunces Tavern Museum, and we hope to see you again soon.